Imagine a dark-skinned girl with long, curly hair sitting behind the wheel of her car. This isn't just a car. It's her little world, her refuge from the daily hustle. She's wearing her favorite sunglasses, even though the sun isn't shining as brightly as usual. Inside the car, an upbeat track plays, the kind she absolutely loves. It's the song that lifts her spirits and makes her forget her troubles. She sways slightly to the rhythm, occasionally humming along, laughing to herself and savoring the moment, unaware that her world is about to turn upside down. Around her, life flows in its usual rhythm. Pedestrians hurry about their business, someone on a bicycle whizzes past, and a couple on the corner exchanges tender glances. The air is filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the nearby cafe, and even the scent of the city hustle seems pleasant. She navigates familiar streets confidently, turning at intersections and sometimes stopping at red lights, glancing at the people around her. In those moments, life feels beautiful, and she belongs to this city, to this moment. But, as it often happens, calmness is merely a precursor to a storm. Suddenly, in the rearview mirror, she notices a bright light, a flashing blue light of a police car swiftly approaching her. Her heart stops for a moment. She doesn't understand what's happening. She hasn't broken any rules, hasn't sped, hasn't been distracted by her phone. Why is she being pulled over? The thought that she might have done something wrong flickers in her mind, but is quickly dismissed. She had a perfect day, and she isn't going to let it be ruined. In such moments, when someone suddenly intrudes upon our peaceful lives, real drama unfolds. Of course, she has heard stories of police stopping people for no apparent reason, but she always thought of it as something distant, happening to others. But now, she's slowly coming to a stop, feeling the pressure in her chest rise. For a long time, she couldn't understand how to react. Inside her, different feelings swirl: anxiety, anger, and confusion. Gathering her thoughts, she realizes she can't simply give in and let the situation take control. She takes a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the anticipation of an unpleasant surprise continues to build. She presses her lips together and resolves to be ready for any outcome. In those moments, a flurry of questions whirl in her mind. What will happen next? How will the officer behave? Will I be able to stand up for my rights? Now she has stopped and rolled down her window. The officer approaches her car, his face serious, intensifying the atmosphere. The girl tries not to betray her nervousness. She knows everything should be by the book, but at this moment, real drama begins. How often in life do you find yourself caught off guard by troubles? Right now, she understands that even the most ordinary moments can turn into something completely unexpected and unpredictable. The officer who stopped her is quite a brusque character. As he approaches the car, his expression immediately reveals his intentions. It's tense, almost aggressive, as if he's ready for a conflict. A chill runs down her spine, but she still doesn't grasp what is actually happening. The officer doesn't bother to explain why he stopped her. No mention of an infraction, no apologies. Just a cold gaze scanning her as if she were a suspect in something terrible. As he stands there, she feels confusion and disorientation. Thoughts race through her mind about how she's going to get home in time for a meeting with friends. She thinks about all she has to do and how she doesn't want to waste time on unclear disputes with the police. In her view, this was just an unnecessary halt in her already busy day. As she ponders her next steps, her dissatisfaction grows. Why can't he just explain the situation instead of approaching her with such a haughty and grim face? When she finally couldn't hold back and began to protest, her voice came out slightly louder than she expected. "What the hell?" she exclaimed. "Why can't you just explain what's going on like a human being?" She knew this could only escalate the conflict, but emotions overwhelmed her. The officer merely frowned in response, his eyes still regarding her with disapproval. This is the moment when words turn into weapons, and each tries to prove their point. She felt her nerves fraying and the tension in the situation building. In such moments, people often lose their composure, and real chaos ensues. Shouting, emotions, unwillingness to listen to one another. Everything spirals out of control. She understood that she shouldn't have reacted this way, but her inner world was constricted by feelings of hurt and injustice. Sometimes it seems that in such moments, We become our most vulnerable selves, defenseless and raw, and it's hard to admit that. The girl continued to argue with the officer, feeling not only anger but also helplessness swell inside her. Her voice became increasingly emotional as she tried to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong. At that moment, something unexpected happened in the back seat of the car. Her husband, who had always supported her in difficult situations, suddenly woke up from a brief nap. He wasn't just any husband. He was the city's chief of police, and this circumstance drastically changed the course of events. Imagine this. The police officer standing next to the girl suddenly realizes that the person sitting in the back seat is his boss. The confidence with which he had been rude to the woman evaporated in an instant, and he turned pale, as if a spirit had escaped from a bottle and blown in his face. He understood that he might be making a huge mistake, not realizing who he was truly dealing with. An internal horror gripped him as he began to comprehend that his behavior could have serious consequences for his career. This was a scene that could have seemed comical if it weren't so sad. The officer, who had completely ignored the girl's words until now, abruptly changed his tone. His once self-assured face now appeared bewildered, and he was even sweating. As soon as he realized that a person who could easily determine his fate stood behind this girl, he seemed at a loss for how to react. In that moment, the tension in the air became almost palpable, and as his face twisted more and more with fear, the girl, witnessing this, felt her confidence return. She knew she now had an ace up her sleeve. The officer, who until that moment had refused to hear a word from her, was now almost begging for forgiveness. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean anything by it," he said, his voice trembling as if he was on the verge of tears. The girl could see him trying to smooth things over, but fear was already evident in his eyes. He likely thought that with just one word from her husband, he could lose his job. Suddenly, the entire dynamic of the conversation shifted. Instead of conflict, a situation full of misunderstanding and sincerity developed. It was a moment when the unequal battle between her and the officer turned against him, and while she felt pride swelling in her heart, she also understood that every action has its consequences. How quickly our perception of a situation can change with an unexpected twist. Now, there was no need for her to continue arguing. She simply looked at the frightened officer, realizing that it was his own actions that led to this turn of events. In the tense silence, as the officer finally grasped that his words could have serious repercussions, she felt not only satisfaction but also pity. How easily one can lose everything due to pride and rash actions. As the tension reached its peak and silence hung in the air, the girl's husband, sitting in the back seat, suddenly broke the silence. His voice was confident and stern, as if he were the very embodiment of the law. "Listen, I heard what you said, and you know what?" he began, addressing the officer, who was visibly anxious about what would happen next. At that moment, all attention turned to him, and anticipation reflected on the faces of everyone present. The girl's husband continued, "You really did have a point when you scolded my wife." So unexpected was this that even the officer could hardly believe his ears. How could this be? He had expected the husband to defend his wife, but instead, he heard words that seemed to support the officer. However, when he continued, the atmosphere changed immediately. "But," he added with cold calmness, "no one has the right to raise their voice at my wife. That is unacceptable." These words came as a real shock to the officer. In his eyes, one could see his confidence dissipating. The girl's husband, despite his stern manner, spoke with deep conviction that, no matter how right one might think they are, maintaining respect is what matters most. He understood that there should be mutual respect in their interactions, and if someone crossed that line, it should not go unnoticed. The officer began to tremble with fear, as if realizing that his actions could have serious consequences. He knew that the husband's words could mean the end of his job, and that thought paralyzed him. Suddenly, he understood that his rudeness could cost him his career, and this realization became a true test for him. And at the most decisive moment, as the tension peaked, the girl's husband stepped out of the car, his figure standing as a symbol of authority and justice. He looked at the officer with genuine seriousness and said, "I'm firing you for that behavior." In that instant, it felt as though time stood still. The officer, now feeling unsteady, froze in place, as if someone had pulled the ground out from under him. He realized that his career hinged on a single word, and that word had just been spoken. This moment became a true turning point. The officer, who had felt so high and mighty before, now stood at a crossroads. To acknowledge his mistakes and improve, or to remain shrouded in the shadows of his actions. Tears were surely welling in his eyes. He clearly hadn't expected that a routine stop could end in such a dramatic fashion. How swiftly everything can change when emotions and stereotypes are involved. At that point, the officer simply broke down in tears. It was an incredibly poignant scene. How often does someone realize their mistake but not know how to apologize? Interestingly, even the most complicated situations can yield good outcomes if we just pause and look at them from a different angle. And as for our police officer, his career ultimately crumbled due to one thoughtless act. Do you know what happened next? He ended up working as a janitor at their police station. It was such an ironic conclusion to the whole situation. We often think that when something goes wrong, it's the end, but in reality, it can be the beginning of something new. Why not look at life from a different perspective? Well, that's the story, and each of us can take something from it, learn something new, and reflect on how we communicate with others.